For thousands of years, philosophers have asked a question that still challenges us today. Why do two people face the same world yet build completely different lives? The answer may have less to do with talent, luck, or circumstance than with something far more subtle. Your thoughts. Not every passing thought that enters your mind, but the repeated patterns that quietly become beliefs, habits, decisions, and eventually the direction of your life. Ancient teachers understood that long before the outer world changes, something changes within. Most people never learn how this invisible process works. They live inside their thoughts without ever observing them. In this audiobook, you'll uncover timeless principles about the hidden architecture of the mind, why your inner world influences your outer experience, and how becoming aware of your thinking can transform the way you live. The greatest force shaping your future may already be with you. The question is whether you have learned to recognize it. Chapter 1. The Invisible Conversation. Happening inside you long before. Your words shape the world around you. Something else is already shaping your world from within. It is quiet, almost invisible, so familiar that most people no longer notice it. It follows you into every meeting, every relationship, every difficult decision, every moment of uncertainty, and every dream you dare or refuse to pursue. It is the conversation that never truly stops, the conversation inside your own mind. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Human beings do not simply experience life. They experience the stories they continuously tell themselves about life. Most people assume they are thinking consciously, yet much of what fills the mind each day is not deliberate thought at all. It is repetition, old conclusions, inherited beliefs, automatic interpretations, endless internal commentary. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Every life begins with an inner conversation. Few people ever become aware of this. If someone were to follow you throughout an ordinary day, they would hear your spoken words only occasionally. But if they could somehow hear the dialogue taking place inside your mind, they would discover something astonishing. Thousands of silent sentences, small judgments, tiny predictions, quiet assumptions, questions, memories, fears, expectations, some encouraging, some discouraging, most completely unnoticed. The remarkable thing is not that these thoughts exist. The remarkable thing, how powerfully they influence the way reality is experienced. Imagine walking into a room where no one has spoken a single word to you. One person immediately thinks, "I don't belong here." Another quietly says, "I'm curious about who I might meet." A third wonders, "I hope I don't embarrass myself." The room has not changed. The people have not changed. Reality itself has not changed. Only the conversation within has changed. Yet before the evening is over, each person may leave believing they experienced a completely different event. The ancient teachers observed this pattern centuries ago. They understood that experience is rarely determined by circumstances alone. Between every event and every response stands interpretation. And interpretation is born from the inner conversation. Most people never notice this. They believe life simply happens to them. They rarely consider that much of what they experience is filtered through invisible assumptions they have been carrying for years. Imagine looking through colored glass. Everything beyond the glass appears to possess the same color. Eventually, you forget you're looking through a filter at all. You assume the world itself is that color. The mind often works in exactly the same way. Our thoughts become lenses. Our beliefs become filters. Our inner dialogue quietly colors everything we encounter. The outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. Consider something as ordinary as receiving constructive criticism. One person immediately hears, "I'm not good enough." Another hears, "This is an opportunity to improve." The words spoken by the other person remain identical. The meaning becomes completely different. What created the difference? Not the event, the conversation taking place within. Every life begins with an inner conversation. This conversation does not begin in adulthood. In many ways, it begins long before we recognize it. The ancient teachers understood that the human mind absorbs impressions long before it learns to question them. A child hears repeated messages. You are talented. You are difficult. Money is hard to earn. People cannot be trusted. You should never fail. Over time, these statements cease to feel like opinions. They become internal voices. Eventually, they sound like personal truth. Most people never ask where these thoughts originally came from, because they have heard them for so long that they mistake familiarity for certainty. Few people ever become aware of this. One of the greatest illusions of the mind is believing that every thought belongs to us simply because it appears within us. The ancient philosophers challenged this assumption. They encouraged observation before belief. They asked a simple but profound question. Who is speaking inside your mind? Is it your own wisdom? An old fear? Someone else's expectations? A childhood memory? A cultural assumption? An inherited belief? The answer is often surprising. Many of the thoughts that shape our lives were never consciously chosen. They were accepted, repeated, reinforced, then quietly adopted as identity. This hidden process influences nearly every area of modern life. Consider a young professional preparing for an important job interview. Everything appears ready. The resume is polished. The clothing is prepared. The qualifications are strong. Yet just before entering the building, another voice begins speaking. What if I'm not qualified enough? What if they see through me? What if I fail? Notice what happens next. The body becomes tense. Breathing becomes shallow. Attention shifts away from curiosity and toward fear. The interview has not yet begun. Nothing has happened externally, yet internally, an entire reality has already been created. Again, the hidden cause precedes the visible effect. Now imagine another individual standing in the same situation. Their inner conversation sounds different. I've prepared well. I don't need to be perfect. This is simply a conversation. I'll learn something regardless of the outcome. The uncertainty remains. The interview remains. The future remains unknown. Yet the internal environment has changed completely. That change influences posture, tone of voice, eye contact, confidence, decision-making. The outer experience begins reflecting the inner condition, not because thoughts magically alter reality, but because thoughts quietly influence perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. This is where the ancient teachers understood something that modern society often overlooks. The smallest conversations frequently produce the largest consequences, not in a single day, but over years. Imagine hearing the sentence, "I'm just not creative," every day for 20 years. Or, "I'm always unlucky." Or, "I never finish what I start." At first, these appear to be harmless observations. Eventually, they become expectations. Expectations become behavior. Behavior becomes evidence. Evidence strengthens belief. And the cycle continues. The principle operates whether you are aware of it or not. The hidden conversation becomes the hidden architect. Most people never notice this because the voice feels normal. It has been there for so long that it sounds like reality itself. yet the wise learn to separate the voice from the observer. This is one of the oldest practices found throughout many traditions of philosophy. Not silencing the mind, observing it, listening without immediately believing, watching without automatically obeying. Because the moment you begin observing your inner conversation, something remarkable happens. You realize that not every thought deserves your agreement. Not every fear deserves your loyalty. Not every conclusion deserves to become your identity. A quiet distance begins to appear. Within that distance lies freedom. Within that freedom lies choice. And within choice lies transformation. The ancient teachers understood that awareness always comes before change. You cannot redirect a conversation you refuse to hear. You cannot question a belief you never notice. You cannot transform an inner world that remains hidden from your attention. This is why observation was considered the beginning of wisdom. Not because observation solves every problem, but because it reveals the problems that were previously invisible. Every life begins with an inner conversation. The question is not whether you have one. You already do. The question is whether it serves you or silently directs you. As you move through the coming days, notice the sentences that repeat most often. Notice the predictions, the assumptions, the labels, the quiet judgments. Do not rush to change them. Simply observe them. Because awareness is the first doorway, and every doorway leads somewhere. Once you recognize that an invisible conversation has been shaping your experience all along, you can never listen to your own mind in quite the same way again. But this realization leads to an even deeper mystery. If so much of our inner dialogue was never consciously chosen, where did it come from? Why do certain beliefs feel so natural, even when they quietly limit us? To answer that question, we must explore the forgotten origins of thought itself. Chapter 2. Why most thoughts are not really yours. If the previous chapter revealed that an invisible conversation is taking place inside every human mind, another question immediately follows. Who started that conversation? When did those thoughts first appear? And perhaps most importantly, how many of the beliefs you call your own were ever truly chosen? Most people never ask these questions. The thoughts feel so familiar that they seem inseparable from identity itself. I've always been this way. This is just my personality. This is how I think. These statements sound natural, yet the ancient teachers often invited their students to examine something deeper. Is that really your voice? Or is it an echo? The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Before the mind learns to create, it learns to imitate. Every child enters the world without fixed opinions about success, failure, wealth, relationships, or self-worth. They observe, they absorb, they imitate. Long before they learn to question ideas, they learn to repeat them. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. The mind first imitates before it creates. Imagine entering a vast library as a child. You cannot yet write your own books. You simply collect the books that others hand to you. Some are filled with courage, others with fear. Some teach possibility, others teach limitation. At first, you have no reason to question what you are reading. The books simply become your understanding of the world. The human mind develops in much the same way. Before it becomes an author, it becomes a collector. Before it creates beliefs, it inherits them. Few people ever become aware of this. The first teachers most of us encounter are not philosophers. They are parents, family members, friends, teachers, communities, the culture surrounding us. Each one contributes small pieces to the invisible architecture of our thinking, sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally. A parent worried about financial security may frequently say, "Money is hard to earn." A child hears the sentence once, then again, and again. Years later, the words are no longer remembered, but the belief remains, not because it has been carefully examined, but because it has been quietly repeated. The principle operates whether you are aware of it or not. The same process happens with confidence. One child repeatedly hears, "You'll figure it out." Another repeatedly hears, "Be careful, you'll probably fail." Neither child consciously chooses these messages. Yet over time, the messages become expectations. Expectations become habits of thought. Habits of thought become ways of seeing the world. Again, the outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. The ancient philosophers observed that culture itself functions as a great storyteller. Every generation inherits invisible narratives. Stories about success, stories about failure, stories about what is possible, stories about who deserves happiness, stories about what kind of person someone should become. Most people never stop to ask whether these stories are true. They simply continue telling them to themselves. Imagine someone growing up in an environment where every successful person is described with suspicion, where wealth is associated with greed, where ambition is mistaken for selfishness. Years later, that individual may sincerely desire financial freedom. Yet every time opportunity appears, an invisible conflict begins. Part of the mind wants success. Another part quietly associates success with something negative. The person hesitates. They delay. They underestimate themselves. They withdraw from opportunities they secretly desire. To an outside observer, the behavior seems confusing. To the ancient teachers, it reveals a hidden pattern. The inherited belief continues directing the conversation. The mind first imitates before it creates. This principle extends far beyond money. Consider relationships. Some people grow up watching calm disagreement. Others grow up surrounded by conflict. Some witness trust. Others witness constant suspicion. These early experiences become more than memories. They become mental templates. Years later, those templates quietly influence expectations. A person who has learned to expect rejection may interpret silence as abandonment. A delayed message becomes evidence that something is wrong. A harmless misunderstanding becomes proof that relationships are unsafe. The event itself is small. The inherited pattern gives it meaning. Most people never notice this. They assume they are responding to the present moment. In reality, they are often responding to an old story carried into the present. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has forgotten. Many people mistake familiarity for truth. If an idea has been repeated often enough, it begins to feel unquestionable. Yet repetition does not guarantee wisdom. It only guarantees familiarity. This is why the wise have always practiced reflection. Not to reject everything they inherited, but to examine it. To ask, is this belief helping me see clearly? Did I choose this idea, or did I simply receive it? Does this thought belong to the present, or is it repeating something from the past? These questions are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of awareness, and awareness creates freedom. Consider another modern example. A young entrepreneur begins building a business. Every setback feels personal. Every rejection feels permanent. Why? Not because rejection is inherently devastating, but because somewhere beneath awareness, an inherited belief whispers, "If I fail, I am a failure." Another entrepreneur experiences the same rejection, yet their internal dialogue sounds different. This is information. This is part of the process. What can I learn? The event remains identical. The inherited belief changes everything. Again, the hidden cause always precedes the visible effect. The ancient teachers often compared the mind to fertile soil. Seeds are planted long before the harvest appears. Some seeds produce confidence. Others produce fear. Some produce resilience. Others produce hesitation. The soil does not immediately reveal what has been planted. Only time reveals the harvest. And by the time the harvest appears, many have forgotten where the seeds came from. The mind first imitates before it creates. This realization is not meant to produce blame. Parents do the best they can with the beliefs they themselves inherited. Teachers pass on what they believe to be true. Societies preserve ideas that have accumulated over generations. Everyone becomes both student and teacher. The ancient teachers were not interested in assigning fault. They were interested in restoring awareness, because once you recognize that many thoughts were inherited, something extraordinary becomes possible. You can begin choosing. For perhaps the first time, you can ask which beliefs deserve to remain and which deserve to be questioned. Not every inherited idea is limiting. Many are deeply valuable. Integrity, compassion, curiosity, discipline, patience. These too can be inherited. Wisdom does not require rejecting the past. It requires examining it. The student becomes more than an imitator. The student becomes a conscious participant. This is the beginning of mental independence, not independence from other people, independence from unconscious thinking. The ancient teachers believed that true freedom begins when observation becomes stronger than imitation, when awareness becomes stronger than habit, when deliberate choice becomes stronger than inherited assumption. The mind first imitates before it creates, yet it does not have to imitate forever. There comes a moment in every person's life when they can begin writing new chapters instead of endlessly rereading old ones. That moment begins with a simple realization. Not every thought that enters your mind deserves to become your identity. Not every belief that shaped your past deserves to shape your future. Once you recognize that many of your thoughts were inherited, you can never examine your own mind in quite the same way again. But another mystery still remains. If thoughts can be inherited, if beliefs can shape perception, how do those invisible ideas become the visible experiences we call reality? To answer that question, we must explore one of the oldest principles preserved within ancient wisdom. Chapter 3. The Ancient Principle of Mental Creation. If many of our thoughts were inherited rather than consciously chosen, another question naturally arises. What happens after a thought enters the mind? Does it simply appear and disappear? Or does it begin a process that quietly shapes the course of our lives? The ancient teachers devoted enormous attention to this question. Not because they believed every passing thought possessed extraordinary power, but because they observed something far more subtle. Before an action is taken, it is interpreted. Before a decision is made, it is evaluated. Before experience becomes memory, it is given meaning. This hidden process occurs so quickly that most people mistake it for reality itself. Yet it is not reality. It is interpretation. And this is where the hidden law reveals itself. Everything begins in the mind. Most people never notice this. They believe they are responding directly to life. In truth, they are often responding to the meaning their minds have assigned to life. There is an important distinction between an event and the story attached to that event. The event exists. The story is created. Imagine two travelers standing on the same mountain as a dense fog suddenly rolls in. One becomes frustrated. The journey has been ruined. The other becomes fascinated. The landscape has changed. This is something I've never seen before. The fog itself remains exactly the same. Nature has made no decision about whether the moment is beautiful or disappointing. The difference exists entirely within the observer. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. The human mind is not merely a recorder of experience, it is an interpreter of experience. And interpretation quietly shapes the life that follows. Everything begins in the mind. Imagine receiving a brief message from someone close to you. The message simply says, "We need to talk." Nothing more. No explanation. No emotion. No conclusion. One person immediately assumes the worst. They replay every recent conversation. They imagine conflict. They create anxiety before the conversation has even taken place. Another person simply wonders, "I wonder what they would like to discuss." The same words, the same message, the same reality. Yet two entirely different experiences begin unfolding. The event remains neutral. Interpretation gives it emotional weight. Few people ever become aware of this, because interpretation happens almost instantly. It feels automatic, natural, invisible, like breathing. Yet the ancient philosophers repeatedly encouraged their students to slow down just enough to notice the hidden step between event and response. That hidden step is where freedom begins. The outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. This principle becomes especially clear during moments of failure. Failure is one of the most revealing experiences in human life, not because failure determines the future, but because interpretation does. Imagine two young entrepreneurs launching their first businesses. Both invest months of effort. Both encounter unexpected setbacks. Eventually, both businesses fail. The external event is identical, yet the internal response begins creating two different futures. The first entrepreneur quietly concludes, "I've proven that I'm not capable. I should have known this wouldn't work. I'm simply not the kind of person who succeeds." Those thoughts become hesitation. Hesitation becomes inaction. Inaction gradually becomes a life that confirms the original belief. The second entrepreneur experiences the same disappointment, yet their internal conversation follows another path. What can this teach me? What mistakes can I correct? What skills do I still need to develop? The failure becomes information rather than identity. Months later, they begin again. Years later, their stories may look completely different, not because failure treated them differently, because interpretation did. Everything begins in the mind. The ancient teachers observed that the mind is constantly searching for meaning. Human beings rarely tolerate uncertainty for long. When something unexpected happens, the mind rushes to explain it. Sometimes those explanations are accurate. Often they are simply familiar. This explains why two people raised in different environments may experience the same event, yet understand it in completely different ways. One sees rejection. Another sees redirection. One sees criticism. Another sees instruction. One sees difficulty. Another sees preparation. Again, the event remains unchanged. The meaning evolves within the mind. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Experience is rarely shaped by events alone. It is shaped by the relationship between events and interpretation. The ancient teachers often compared this process to an artist standing before a blank canvas. The canvas represents the event. The painting represents interpretation. Two artists may receive identical materials, yet produce completely different works, not because the canvas changed, because the vision differed. The mind quietly paints meaning onto experience. Most people never notice this. They assume life itself contains fixed meanings. Yet much of what we experience is filtered through expectations accumulated over years. A person expecting betrayal often notices signs of betrayal. A person expecting opportunity often notices possibilities. A person expecting failure often becomes highly sensitive to obstacles. Attention follows expectation. Expectation shapes interpretation. Interpretation influences action. The hidden cause always precedes the visible effect. This does not mean we should ignore reality. The ancient teachers were remarkably practical. Pain exists. Loss exists. Disappointment exists. Injustice exists. The purpose of this principle is not to deny life's difficulties. It is to reveal that our relationship with those difficulties remains open to influence. Consider two athletes preparing for the same competition. Both feel nervous. Both recognize the importance of the event. One interprets nervousness as weakness. "I'm falling apart." The other interprets the same physical sensations differently. "My body is preparing to perform." The heartbeat remains the same. The breathing remains the same. The chemistry within the body remains remarkably similar. The interpretation changes. The response changes. The outcome often changes. Again, everything begins in the mind. The ancient teachers understood that thoughts rarely become actions immediately. Between them lies interpretation. Interpretation becomes emotion. Emotion influences behavior. Behavior creates consequence. This entire chain often unfolds so quickly that it appears invisible. Yet awareness slows the process. Awareness creates space. Within that space, choice becomes possible. Most people never notice this hidden sequence. They believe they acted because of circumstances. The wise learn to examine the interpretation that came first. Because changing interpretation often changes direction, the principle operates whether you're aware of it or not. Think of a river flowing through a valley. The water follows the shape of the land beneath it. Human behavior often follows the shape of interpretation in much the same way. Actions naturally flow toward the meanings we have created. If life is interpreted as hostile, behavior becomes defensive. If life is interpreted as filled with possibility, behavior becomes exploratory. Again, the outer world reflects the inner condition. This is why the ancient teachers placed such importance on conscious awareness, not to force positive thinking, not to deny reality, but to recognize that interpretation is not always truth. Sometimes it is habit. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it is an inherited belief repeating itself once again. And once we recognize that, another possibility emerges. We can begin asking different questions. Instead of immediately concluding, "This is terrible," we might ask, "What else could this mean?" Instead of saying, "I've failed," we might ask, "What is this experience teaching me?" The event remains. The interpretation changes. The future begins changing with it. Everything begins in the mind. This ancient principle is less about controlling the world and more about understanding how the world becomes meaningful to us. Meaning influences action. Action influences habit. Habit influences character. Character gradually shapes the direction of a life. The hidden conversation becomes the hidden architect once again. And as this understanding deepens, another question naturally appears. If interpretation shapes experience, can the patterns of interpretation themselves be changed? Can old stories be rewritten? Can inherited meanings be replaced with conscious understanding? The ancient teachers believed they could, not through force, not through denial, but through deliberate awareness practiced over time. That is the doorway to the next principle. Chapter 4. The Patterns That Quietly Become Destiny. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest. Before you lies a narrow trail. It is barely visible. Someone has walked this path only once. Now imagine that the same trail is used again tomorrow. Then the next day. Then the next week. Months pass. Years pass. Eventually, the narrow trail becomes a well-worn road. Traveling it requires almost no effort. The ancient teachers believed the human mind develops in much the same way. A single thought rarely changes a life, but a thought repeated often enough becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes automatic, and what becomes automatic quietly begins shaping destiny. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Patterns become destiny. Most people never notice this. They pay attention to dramatic moments, the promotion, the failure, the wedding, the argument, the breakthrough. Yet the ancient philosophers understood that lives are rarely built by dramatic moments alone. Lives are built by repeated moments, small decisions, repeated interpretations, daily conversations with oneself, tiny habits of attention that quietly accumulate over time. Again and again, the same thought returns. I'll do it tomorrow. I'm not ready. People like me never succeed. I'll probably fail. At first, these appear to be isolated thoughts. Eventually, they become familiar companions. Then they become expectations. Finally, they become identity. The individual no longer says, I have doubtful thoughts. They begin saying, I am a doubtful person. The thought has become the self. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Identity often grows from repetition rather than intention. Patterns become destiny. Consider a sculptor standing before a block of stone. One strike of the hammer changes almost nothing. 1,000 careful strikes slowly reveal an entirely different form. The transformation appears dramatic only at the end. In reality, it was created through countless small actions. The human mind follows a remarkably similar pattern. One encouraging thought changes little. One fearful thought changes little. But thousands of similar thoughts gradually shape perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes experience. Experience reinforces the original pattern. The hidden cause quietly becomes the visible effect. The principle operates whether you are aware of it or not. This explains why people often believe they are simply the way they are. I'm an anxious person. I'm naturally confident. I'm terrible with money. I'm always unlucky. The ancient teachers invited their students to examine these statements carefully. Are these permanent truths, or are they simply well-practiced patterns? There is an important difference. A pattern can be strengthened. A pattern can weaken. A pattern can be replaced, but only after it is recognized. Few people ever become aware of this. Imagine someone learning to play the piano. During the first lesson, every movement requires conscious effort. Each note feels unfamiliar. Every mistake demands correction. Months later, the same movements happen effortlessly. The fingers no longer think. They remember. The repetition has become a pattern. The same process quietly unfolds in the mind. Repeated emotional reactions become familiar. Repeated beliefs become automatic. Repeated expectations become default responses. What was once chosen gradually becomes unconscious. Patterns become destiny. This principle becomes especially visible when comparing optimism and chronic doubt. The ancient teachers never suggested that optimism meant ignoring reality, nor did they encourage blind positivity. They were pointing toward something much deeper, a habitual direction of attention. Imagine two colleagues beginning the same project. Unexpected problems arise. Deadlines become difficult. Both experience uncertainty. The first quietly says, "There must be a way through this." The second immediately concludes, "This never works." Neither person knows the future, yet their internal patterns begin shaping the future they will eventually experience. The optimistic individual remains curious. They continue searching. They ask questions. They experiment. The doubtful individual withdraws. Effort decreases. Opportunities become harder to notice. The same challenge produces two different paths. Again, not because the world changed, because the pattern changed. Everything begins in the mind. Most people assume confidence creates success. The ancient teachers often observed the opposite process as well. Repeated courageous actions gradually create confidence. Repeated disciplined actions gradually create discipline. Repeated honest conversations gradually create trust. Repeated avoidance gradually creates fear. Again and again, the same principle appears. Small repetitions become lasting identities. The outer world reflects the inner condition. Think of water flowing over stone. One drop changes nothing. Millions of drops reshape the landscape. Human thought operates with similar patience. The mind rarely changes overnight. It changes gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. This is why people often fail to recognize transformation while it is occurring. One day seems insignificant. One conversation seems insignificant. One decision seems insignificant. Yet years later, those moments reveal themselves as turning points. The ancient teachers understood that time amplifies repetition. Time turns habits into character, character into reputation, reputation into opportunity, opportunity into destiny. Patterns become destiny. This principle applies far beyond personal psychology. It appears in relationships. A couple that repeatedly chooses honest communication slowly builds trust. Another couple repeatedly avoids difficult conversations. Resentment quietly accumulates. Neither relationship changes dramatically in a single day. The future is shaped through repetition. The hidden cause quietly matures beneath the surface. The same pattern appears in careers. One individual spends 15 minutes every evening learning a new skill. The effort seems insignificant. Another spends those same minutes drifting through endless distraction. Months pass, then years. Eventually, their lives appear dramatically different. Observers often call it talent, luck, timing. The ancient teachers might simply ask, what patterns were repeated? Most people never notice this because repetition lacks excitement. We celebrate dramatic transformations. We overlook ordinary consistency. Yet history repeatedly suggests that remarkable lives are often built through remarkably ordinary actions performed consistently. This is where the hidden law reveals itself again. The future is rarely created by a single decision. It is created by decisions that quietly become habits, and habits that quietly become identity. The principle operates whether you understand it or not. Fortunately, the ancient teachers also recognized another truth. If repetition created the pattern, repetition can reshape the pattern. The road formed by years of walking is not permanent. A new path may seem difficult at first, unnatural, uncomfortable, yet every deliberate step strengthens it. Every conscious choice weakens the old route and strengthens the new one. This is why awareness is so important. You cannot redirect a pattern you never recognize. You cannot transform an identity built upon unconscious repetition. But once the pattern becomes visible, something extraordinary happens. Choice returns. The future begins opening once again. Patterns become destiny, but awareness changes patterns, and changed patterns create different futures. This realization brings us to another profound question. If our lives are shaped by repeated inner stories, can those stories themselves be rewritten? Can inherited narratives lose their power? Can an old identity give way to a new one built consciously rather than unconsciously? The ancient teachers believed the answer was yes, not through force, not through denial, but through the patient art of rewriting the stories we live by. And that is where our journey now continues. Chapter 5. Rewriting the stories you live by. There comes a moment in every person's life when a quiet realization begins to emerge. Perhaps the thoughts guiding your life are not permanent. Perhaps the patterns that have shaped your decisions are not fixed. Perhaps the story you have been living is not the only story available to you. This possibility has inspired philosophers for thousands of years, not because they believed human beings could erase the past, but because they understood something far more profound. The past may explain your present. It does not have to imprison your future. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Awareness rewrites the story. Most people never notice this. They believe they are living reality itself. The ancient teachers suggested that many people are actually living inside narratives they stopped questioning long ago. Every person carries an invisible collection of stories. Stories about who they are. Stories about what they deserve. Stories about what is possible. Stories about failure. Stories about love. Stories about success. Stories about the future. At first, these stories seem harmless. Eventually, they become lenses. Then, they become identities. Finally, they become invisible boundaries. The remarkable thing is that these stories rarely announce themselves as stories. They arrive disguised as facts. I've never been confident. I'm not a leader. I've always struggled with money. I'm simply not creative. The sentences sound certain. The ancient teachers invited their students to ask a different question. Are these facts? Or are they interpretations repeated so often that they now feel permanent? Few people ever become aware of this. Imagine reading the same chapter of a book every day for 20 years. Eventually, you would know every sentence by heart. You might even forget that other chapters exist. The mind often behaves in exactly the same way. It repeats familiar explanations until they appear unquestionable. Yet repetition does not transform a story into truth. It simply makes the story familiar. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has forgotten. The mind often confuses familiarity with reality. This explains why two people with nearly identical abilities can build entirely different lives. One quietly repeats, "I'll eventually figure it out." The other continually whispers, "I'm probably not capable." Neither statement is supported by certainty. Both become powerful through repetition. The hidden cause always precedes the visible effect. Consider a young woman who dreams of becoming an architect. She studies the work of great designers. She feels inspired. Yet every time she considers applying for an important opportunity, another voice appears. "People like me don't succeed. I'm not talented enough. I'll embarrass myself." Eventually, she decides not to apply. Months later, she tells herself, "I guess it simply wasn't meant to be." The opportunity appears to have disappeared because of external circumstances. The ancient teachers would gently point toward another possibility. Perhaps the invisible story determined the visible decision. Again, the outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. Now imagine another individual with similar uncertainty. They also experience doubt. They also hear the familiar voice saying, "What if you fail?" But instead of accepting the thought as truth, they become curious. Is this a fact? Or is this only an old story? This single moment of observation changes everything. Nothing external has changed. Yet awareness has entered the conversation. And awareness changes the relationship with thought. Awareness rewrites the story. The ancient philosophers rarely encouraged people to fight against their minds. They understood that resistance often strengthens what we resist. Instead, they encouraged observation, quiet attention, patient curiosity, to observe without immediate judgment, to notice without immediate identification. Imagine sitting in a theater. Thoughts appear on the stage one after another, some dramatic, some fearful, some hopeful, some discouraging. Most people immediately climb onto the stage and begin acting within every scene. The wise remain in the audience. They observe. They recognize that every performance is not reality. Some thoughts deserve attention. Others simply pass. The student becomes the observer. This shift may appear small, yet it represents one of the greatest transformations available to the human mind. Because once observation begins, unconscious repetition begins losing its power. Most people never notice this. They assume that because a thought appears, it must be true. The ancient teachers challenged this assumption. A thought is an event, not a command, not a prophecy, not an identity. Simply an event occurring within awareness. This understanding creates extraordinary freedom. Imagine someone who has spent years believing, "I'm not capable." The sentence has become familiar. It has influenced career decisions, relationships, dreams, opportunities. It has quietly shaped an entire life. The ancient teachers would not ask this person to replace the sentence with blind optimism. Instead, they would ask them to investigate it. When did you first begin believing this? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? Who first taught you to think this way? Questions like these loosen the grip of unconscious certainty. The story begins revealing itself as a story, not an unchangeable law. The principle operates whether you are aware of it or not. Modern life offers countless examples of this process. Imagine someone learning a new language. The first attempts feel awkward. Words are forgotten. Pronunciation feels unnatural. An old story immediately appears. "I'm terrible at languages." If that story remains unquestioned, learning often stops. But suppose another story quietly replaces it. "I'm still learning." The circumstances remain identical. The beginner remains a beginner. Yet the new story creates persistence. Persistence creates practice. Practice creates skill. Skill creates confidence. Again, the hidden cause precedes the visible effect. The ancient teachers understood that transformation rarely begins with dramatic external change. It begins with a different relationship to the stories carried within. Not every story deserves to remain. Some were useful during childhood, but limiting during adulthood. Some protected us during difficult moments, but later became unnecessary. Some belonged to other people from the very beginning. Awareness reveals which stories continue serving life and which quietly restrict it. Awareness rewrites the story. This process requires patience. A story repeated for 20 years rarely disappears in 20 minutes. The ancient teachers never promised instant transformation. They understood the rhythm of gradual change. A new story becomes believable through lived experience. One courageous action, then another. One disciplined decision, then another. One honest conversation, then another. Each action quietly offers new evidence. The old narrative weakens. The new narrative grows stronger. The mind slowly begins accepting a different possibility. Again, not through force, through repetition. The same principle that once created limitation now becomes the principle that creates freedom. Patterns become destiny. But conscious patterns create conscious destinies. Imagine an artist restoring an ancient painting. They do not destroy the canvas. They carefully remove layers that have accumulated over time. The original beauty slowly becomes visible. The ancient teachers believed self-understanding often unfolds in a similar way. Transformation is not always about becoming someone completely different. Sometimes it is about removing the stories that prevented your authentic nature from being expressed. Few people ever become aware of this. They spend years attempting to become someone else. The wiser path is often discovering who remains beneath fear, habit, and inherited belief. The student gradually realizes that awareness itself possesses extraordinary creative power. Not because awareness magically changes the external world, but because awareness changes the stories through which the world is experienced. Those stories influence decisions. Decisions influence habits. Habits influence character. Character influences direction, and direction quietly shapes an entire life. Awareness rewrites the story. As this understanding deepens, another question naturally emerges. If our stories influence our choices, what invisible bridge connects thinking itself with the actions we eventually take? How does a quiet idea become a visible behavior? How does an unseen belief become a lived reality? The ancient teachers believed the answer could be found in one of the most overlooked patterns of human life, the hidden link between thought and action. And that is where our journey now continues. Chapter 6. The hidden link between thought and action. Imagine watching a towering oak tree sway in the wind. Its branches stretch toward the sky. Its leaves catch the sunlight. Its trunk appears strong and immovable. To most observers, the tree begins where they can see it. Yet the ancient teachers would ask a different question. Where does the tree truly begin? Does it begin with the trunk, the branches, the leaves? Or did it begin long before any of those became visible, hidden beneath the soil, within a seed, within a process no one could observe? The ancient philosophers believed human action unfolds in much the same way. Every visible decision grows from an invisible beginning. Every action has an unseen origin. Every outcome has a hidden history. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. Most people pay attention only to behavior. They admire discipline. They criticize impulsiveness. They celebrate achievement. They regret failure. Yet behavior is rarely the true beginning. The visible action is often the final expression of a much longer internal process. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Before the hand moves, the mind has already begun. Before the words are spoken, an interpretation has already formed. Before a choice appears outwardly, countless invisible influences have quietly prepared it. Every decision begins with an unseen mental process. Few people ever become aware of this, because the process unfolds with extraordinary speed. A thought appears. A belief gives the thought credibility. The belief influences interpretation. Interpretation shapes emotion. Emotion encourages action. Action produces consequence. The consequence reinforces the original belief. The cycle begins again. Most people experience only the final stage. They see the action. The ancient teachers examined the entire chain. Thought becomes belief. Belief becomes decision. Decision becomes outcome. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. Imagine standing beside a row of dominoes. The final domino falls dramatically. It attracts everyone's attention. Yet the last movement was not the true beginning. It merely completed a chain that started with a single touch. Human behavior often follows exactly the same pattern. The decision everyone notices is usually the last domino. The first domino may have fallen hours, years, or even decades earlier, perhaps as a single belief quietly accepted without question. Everything begins in the mind. Consider an individual who has always believed, "I never finish what I start." At first glance, this appears to be an observation. In reality, it often functions as a prediction. When they begin learning a new skill, the belief quietly accompanies them. The first obstacle appears. The mind immediately whispers, "See? This is exactly what always happens." Motivation fades. Practice stops. The project remains unfinished. The outcome appears to confirm the original belief. Yet the belief itself quietly influenced every step leading to that outcome. Again, the outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. The ancient teachers frequently compared the mind to the source of a river. People living downstream see only the water arriving. They rarely travel upstream to discover where the river begins. Likewise, most people examine consequences without tracing them back to their origin. Why did I react that way? Why did I avoid that opportunity? Why did I hesitate? Why did I remain silent? These questions become powerful only when followed by another. What belief quietly prepared that decision? The student of ancient wisdom learns to travel upstream, to search for beginnings rather than endings. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. This principle becomes remarkably clear when observing financial discipline. Imagine two friends receiving the same monthly income. Their circumstances are nearly identical. Their opportunities appear similar. Yet 10 years later, their financial lives have moved in completely different directions. Observers often explain the difference through luck, timing, opportunity. The ancient teachers would look deeper. One individual consistently asks, "How can today's decision serve my future?" The other quietly asks, "What do I feel like having today?" Notice the difference. The first question is guided by a long-term vision. The second is guided primarily by immediate emotion. Neither financial future begins with money. Both begin with thought. The hidden cause quietly shapes the visible effect. Over time, the first individual develops habits of saving, learning, investing, and thoughtful decision-making. The second repeatedly chooses immediate comfort over future possibility. No single purchase creates poverty. No single investment creates prosperity. The future is built through repeated mental decisions long before it appears in bank accounts. Again, the hidden cause always precedes the visible effect. Most people never notice this because outcomes are delayed. The consequences of today's thinking rarely appear today. A healthy meal does not transform the body overnight. A disciplined financial decision rarely changes life within a week. One thoughtful conversation does not instantly create lasting trust. Time quietly connects cause with effect. The ancient teachers understood that patience often hides the operation of universal principles. Because time separates causes from consequences, people mistakenly believe no connection exists. Yet the law remains active at all times. Imagine an archer preparing to release an arrow. Once the arrow leaves the bow, changing its direction becomes difficult. The true moment of influence existed earlier. While choosing the target, adjusting posture, steadying the hand. Human decisions operate similarly. The greatest influence often exists before action begins. Within thought, within attention, within belief. The wise therefore focus less on controlling outcomes and more on cultivating the inner conditions from which outcomes emerge. Everything begins in the mind. This understanding transforms the way mistakes are viewed. Most people regret actions. The ancient teachers investigated origins. Instead of asking, "Why did I do that?" they asked, "What belief made that action seem reasonable in the moment?" This subtle shift changes everything, because beliefs can be examined. Beliefs can evolve. Beliefs can be consciously chosen. Actions naturally follow. Imagine someone attempting to develop healthier habits. Again and again, they promise themselves that tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow arrives. Nothing changes. Why? The ancient teachers might suggest that the visible habit is not the real challenge. The deeper challenge lies within the unseen belief. Perhaps the individual quietly believes, "I always give up," or "I don't deserve to feel healthy." As long as the belief remains untouched, every new attempt eventually returns to familiar behavior. The visible struggle reflects an invisible pattern. The principle operates whether you're aware of it or not. This realization is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce clarity. Because once the hidden chain becomes visible, influence becomes possible. The ancient philosophers were remarkably practical. They did not encourage endless self-analysis disconnected from life. They encouraged observation that leads to wiser action. Notice the thought. Question the belief. Choose the decision carefully. Repeat the action consistently. Allow time to reveal the outcome. Then observe again. This cycle becomes the path of conscious living. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. Imagine a craftsman building a cathedral. Day after day, they place individual stones. One stone appears insignificant. Another seems equally ordinary. Years pass. Visitors admire the magnificent structure. Very few appreciate the thousands of invisible decisions that created it. The same is true of character. Character is not formed during dramatic moments alone. It is quietly constructed through repeated choices. Those choices emerge from repeated beliefs. Those beliefs emerge from repeated thoughts. Again, the hidden cause precedes the visible effect. Most people search for techniques that promise instant transformation. The ancient teachers offered something more enduring. Understand beginnings, because whoever understands beginnings gains influence over endings. The person who learns to recognize the first thought before it hardens into belief possesses a freedom many never discover. The person who questions inherited assumptions before they become decisions quietly changes the direction of an entire life. This is the deeper meaning of conscious creation. Not controlling every circumstance, not predicting every outcome, but participating wisely in the invisible processes that eventually become visible reality. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. Everything begins in the mind. These principles have quietly accompanied humanity for centuries. They operate in careers, in relationships, in wealth, in leadership, in every decision made throughout an ordinary day. Yet one profound question still remains. If our beliefs shape our decisions, who ultimately becomes responsible for the life those decisions create? The ancient teachers believed this question marked the beginning of true maturity, because the moment we stop blaming circumstances and begin examining ourselves, a different kind of power becomes available. That power is responsibility, and that is where our journey now continues. Chapter 7. Why responsibility changes everything. There is a moment in every journey of understanding when a difficult question appears. It is not a question about the world. It is not a question about other people. It is a question about ourselves. If thoughts influence beliefs, if beliefs influence decisions, if decisions quietly shape the direction of a life, then who is responsible for the path we are walking? The ancient teachers did not answer this question with judgment. They answered it with possibility, because they understood that responsibility is not merely a burden, it is the beginning of freedom. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Responsibility creates freedom. Most people never notice this. The word responsibility often carries uncomfortable associations: obligation, pressure, guilt, blame. Many spend their lives trying to avoid it. Yet the ancient philosophers used the idea in a very different way. To them, responsibility did not mean accepting fault for every event. It meant recognizing where genuine influence begins. The distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. There are countless things beyond our control: the weather, the economy, the opinions of others, unexpected losses, unexpected opportunities. Life will always contain uncertainty. The ancient teachers never denied this. Instead, they asked a different question. When circumstances arrive, who chooses your response? Few people ever become aware of this, because when life becomes difficult, the mind naturally searches for explanations. Sometimes those explanations are useful. Often they become excuses. An opportunity disappears. Someone else receives the promotion. A relationship ends. A project fails. Immediately, attention moves outward. If only they had. If the situation had been different. If life had treated me more fairly. These thoughts may contain elements of truth. Circumstances do matter. People do influence one another. The world is not perfectly fair. The ancient teachers understood all of this, yet they also recognized something equally important. Whatever attention remains fixed upon eventually shapes perception. If attention remains fixed on what cannot be changed, influence quietly disappears. The outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. Imagine a sailor crossing the sea. They cannot command the wind. They cannot stop the waves. They cannot decide when storms will appear. Yet they remain responsible for something profoundly important: how they adjust the sails. Two sailors may encounter the same storm. One curses the weather until the ship drifts off course. The other studies the wind, adjusts direction, and continues the journey. Neither controlled the storm. One accepted responsibility for the response. This is the wisdom the ancient teachers hoped their students would discover. Freedom does not begin when life becomes predictable. Freedom begins when we recognize our capacity to respond consciously. Responsibility creates freedom. Most people confuse responsibility with blame. The difference is enormous. Blame asks, "Whose fault is this?" Responsibility asks, "What can I do now?" Blame searches for the past. Responsibility creates the future. Blame keeps attention fixed upon events that cannot be undone. Responsibility turns attention toward choices that still remain available. The ancient teachers believed this simple shift marked the beginning of maturity. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because attention begins moving toward influence rather than helplessness. Imagine someone who has struggled financially for years. They may spend every conversation discussing unfair circumstances, the rising cost of living, poor opportunities, bad luck. Perhaps some of these observations are completely accurate, yet if every thought remains focused on what cannot be changed, little room remains for transformation. Now imagine another person in similar circumstances. They acknowledge the difficulty. They do not deny reality. Yet their questions sound different. What skill can I learn? What unnecessary expense can I reduce? What habit has been holding me back? What small step can I take today? Notice what has changed, not the circumstances, the direction of attention. Again, the hidden cause precedes the visible effect. The ancient philosophers repeatedly encouraged curiosity because curiosity interrupts helplessness. A blaming mind seeks confirmation. A curious mind seeks understanding. One closes possibilities. The other opens them. This is why they encouraged questions rather than conclusions. Instead of saying, "This always happens to me," they invited people to ask, "What pattern am I repeating?" Instead of saying, "I can't change this," they asked, "What part of this situation remains within my influence?" Curiosity creates movement. Blame creates paralysis. Most people never notice this, because blame offers temporary comfort. If someone else is entirely responsible, then no difficult inner work appears necessary. Yet comfort often comes with an invisible cost. The cost of influence. The ancient teachers understood that every excuse quietly transfers power away from the individual. Every moment of honest responsibility quietly returns that power. Responsibility creates freedom. This principle extends far beyond careers and finances. It transforms relationships. Imagine two close friends experiencing conflict. One immediately lists everything the other person did wrong. Perhaps much of it is accurate. The other quietly asks, "How did my communication contribute to this misunderstanding? What assumptions did I bring into the conversation? What can I express more clearly next time?" The second individual is not accepting all the blame. They are accepting ownership of their contribution. That ownership creates influence. Influence creates growth. Growth transforms future relationships. Again, the hidden cause becomes visible. The same principle appears in emotional life. Suppose someone frequently says, "They make me angry." The ancient teachers would gently challenge the sentence. Can another person influence emotion? Certainly. Can they completely determine it? That is another question. Between the event and the reaction lies awareness. Within awareness lies choice. The more responsibility we accept for our own thinking, the less completely we become controlled by external events. This does not mean emotions disappear. It means they no longer become unquestioned rulers. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society often forgets. Emotional maturity begins where automatic reaction ends. Again, responsibility is not about denying reality. It is about expanding possibility. Imagine a gardener standing before neglected soil. They could spend years complaining that previous caretakers failed in their responsibilities. Perhaps they would be correct. Yet the soil would remain unchanged. The moment they begin planting new seeds, watering the ground, and removing weeds, the future quietly changes. Not because the past disappeared, but because responsibility shifted attention toward creation. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. This is why the ancient teachers emphasized ownership of thought before ownership of circumstance. You cannot always choose what enters your life. You can gradually learn to choose the meaning you create from it. You cannot always choose the questions life asks. You can choose the questions you ask in return. The quality of those questions often determines the quality of your future. Why me? What if nothing changes? Who is to blame? These questions narrow awareness. What can I learn? What remains possible? What small action is available today? These questions expand awareness. Again, Curiosity becomes a doorway to freedom. Most people never notice that questions quietly organize perception. The mind naturally begins searching for whatever the question requests. Ask, "Why does my life always go wrong?" And the mind quickly collects evidence supporting the conclusion. Ask, "What opportunities have I been overlooking?" And attention begins discovering possibilities that were previously invisible. The outer world has not changed. The observer has. The ancient teachers regarded this as one of the greatest forms of practical wisdom. Not endless optimism, not unrealistic positivity. Deliberate attention guided by meaningful questions. Responsibility creates freedom. Imagine standing before a mirror. The reflection changes only after the person standing before it changes. No amount of arguing with the mirror transforms the image. Life often behaves similarly. The external world frequently reflects patterns that began internally. As within, so without. This does not explain every event. Life remains complex. Yet it reminds us that lasting transformation often begins closer than we imagine. Within thought, within attention, within the willingness to accept responsibility for the one life we are actually capable of directing. The ancient teachers believed that this willingness marked the true beginning of wisdom, not because responsibility solves every problem, but because responsibility restores participation. Instead of becoming passive observers of life, we become conscious participants in it. The hidden conversation becomes intentional. The invisible pattern becomes visible. The next step becomes clear. Responsibility creates freedom. As this principle settles into understanding, another realization naturally follows. If responsibility restores influence, if awareness creates choice, then perhaps the greatest challenge is no longer changing the world around us. Perhaps the greatest challenge is learning to govern the world within us, to direct attention, to cultivate discipline, to observe without reacting automatically, to become master of the inner kingdom before attempting to master anything beyond it. The ancient teachers believed this was the foundation of every enduring achievement, and that is where our journey now continues. Chapter 8. Becoming the observer of your own mind. There is a remarkable discovery that appears again and again throughout the world's oldest traditions of wisdom. It is not hidden because it is complicated. It is hidden because it is so close to us that we rarely think to examine it. The ancient teachers asked a question that at first sounds almost too simple. Who is noticing your thoughts? Take a moment and consider it carefully. A thought appears. Perhaps it says, "I'm worried." Another thought follows. "I should have done better." A memory arrives. An image, a fear, a plan, a hope. Thought after thought moves through the mind like clouds across the sky. Yet if you're able to notice these thoughts, then another part of you must be doing the noticing. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. You're the observer, not every thought. Most people never notice this. They experience a thought and immediately become the thought. A fearful idea appears. They become fear. An angry thought appears. They become anger. A doubtful sentence enters the mind. They immediately identify with doubt. The process happens so quickly that it feels impossible to separate the observer from the experience. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Awareness and thought are not the same thing. The mind produces thoughts. Awareness notices them. This distinction may appear small, yet it changes everything. Imagine sitting beside a quiet river. Leaves drift across the surface of the water. You notice them passing. You do not jump into the river to chase every leaf. You simply watch. The ancient philosophers suggested approaching thoughts in much the same way. Not every thought requires action. Not every thought deserves belief. Not every thought deserves obedience. Some simply pass through awareness. The student becomes the observer. Few people ever become aware of this. Modern life encourages constant reaction. A notification appears. We react. Someone criticizes us. We react. An unexpected problem arises. We react. An uncomfortable emotion appears. We react. Little space exists between experience and response. The ancient teachers devoted enormous attention to creating that space, not because they wished to suppress emotion, not because they believed thoughts were enemies, but because they understood that freedom quietly lives within the pause, between stimulus and response, between thought and action, between emotion and expression. Within that brief moment, awareness awakens, and awareness changes everything. You are the observer, not every thought. Imagine standing in front of a mirror. The mirror reflects every face that appears before it. It does not become the face. Clouds may pass across the sky. The sky does not become the clouds. The ocean reflects the moon. It does not become the moon. The ancient teachers often used similar images to describe awareness itself. Awareness reflects thought. It does not have to become thought. This understanding is deeply practical. Consider an ordinary disagreement between two friends. One careless sentence is spoken. Immediately, the mind begins producing interpretations. They don't respect me. They always do this. I should say something hurtful in return. For many people, these thoughts move directly into words. The conversation quickly becomes an argument. The relationship suffers. The visible conflict appears sudden. Yet the hidden cause existed within the unobserved stream of thinking. Again, the outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. Now imagine the same situation unfolding differently. The critical comment still appears. The thoughts still arise. Anger is still felt. Nothing has been denied. Nothing has been suppressed. Yet something new enters the experience. Observation. Instead of immediately speaking, the individual quietly notices, I'm feeling defensive. I can hear my mind creating a story. I don't have to respond immediately. Only a few seconds pass, yet those few seconds completely alter the direction of the conversation. Awareness created space. Space created choice. Choice created a different future. The hidden cause quietly reshaped the visible effect. Most people never notice how powerful a single pause can become. Because pauses rarely receive attention. They leave no dramatic headlines, no applause, no recognition. Yet many of life's greatest decisions are quietly determined within moments no one else ever sees. The ancient teachers understood this. They believed mastery rarely begins in public. It begins privately. Within attention, within awareness, within the ability to observe without immediately reacting. The principle operates whether you're aware of it or not. This practice does not require extraordinary circumstances. It begins within ordinary moments. Waiting in traffic, receiving unexpected news, reading a difficult message, feeling disappointed after making a mistake. Notice what happens inside. Observe the first thought. Observe the second. Observe the emotional movement. Not to judge it, simply to see it clearly. Most people have spent their entire lives looking outward. The ancient teachers invited them to become students of the inner world, because what remains unseen often remains unchanged. The student becomes the observer. There is another reason this practice matters. Thoughts are remarkably persuasive. They often arrive wearing the clothing of certainty. They say, "This will never work. Everyone is judging you. You always fail." The ancient teachers encouraged a different response. Instead of immediately believing the thought, simply ask, "Is this true? Is this the only possible interpretation? What evidence supports this? What evidence challenges it?" These questions do not silence the mind. They awaken awareness. Again, awareness changes the relationship with thought. Imagine entering a theater. A dramatic film begins playing. The characters cry, fight, celebrate, lose hope, find courage. You may become deeply absorbed in the story, yet somewhere within you remains the quiet knowledge that you are sitting in a theater. The story is real within the film. It is not the whole of reality. The ancient teachers believed thoughts often function in the same way. The mind creates compelling stories. Some are useful, some are misleading. Awareness remembers that every story deserves observation before acceptance. You are the observer, not every thought. This realization transforms emotional life as well. Fear may still appear, but fear is no longer mistaken for identity. Sadness may arrive, but sadness is no longer confused with permanence. Anger may arise, but anger no longer commands immediate obedience. The emotion becomes an experience rather than a definition of the self. The ancient teachers never suggested becoming emotionally empty. Quite the opposite. They encouraged becoming emotionally conscious, feeling deeply, observing clearly, responding wisely. Again, the hidden cause always precedes the visible effect. When awareness deepens, another extraordinary change quietly begins. Compassion naturally increases, not only toward others, toward oneself. The individual recognizes that many difficult thoughts are simply old patterns passing through the mind, not permanent truths, not final identities, just familiar habits seeking repetition. Observation gently weakens their influence. This is why the ancient teachers regarded awareness as one of the highest forms of inner discipline. Not because awareness controls every thought, but because awareness transforms the relationship with thought. The student no longer lives inside every passing idea. The student watches, learns, chooses. The student becomes the observer. You are the observer, not every thought. The more this truth becomes lived experience, the less external circumstances completely determine inner peace. The world remains unpredictable. People remain imperfect. Challenges continue appearing, yet something stable quietly develops beneath all of it. The capacity to remain present, to observe, to choose, to respond rather than merely react. The ancient teachers believed this marked the beginning of genuine self-mastery, not perfection, presence, not control over everything, clarity within anything. And once this clarity begins guiding everyday life, another question naturally arises. How should these principles be lived? How do awareness, observation, responsibility, and disciplined thinking become practical tools within careers, relationships, wealth, leadership, and the ordinary challenges of modern life? Ancient wisdom was never intended to remain hidden inside books. Its purpose was always application. And that is where our journey now continues. Chapter 9. Living by principles instead of emotions. There is a quiet difference between people who build lasting lives and those who spend years moving from one crisis to the next. From a distance, the difference may appear to be intelligence, or talent, or luck. Yet the ancient teachers often pointed somewhere far less obvious. They observed that one group is guided primarily by temporary emotions. The other is guided by enduring principles. Emotions change. Principles remain. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Principles outlast emotions. Most people never notice this, because emotions are immediate. They demand attention. They insist on action. Fear urges retreat. Anger demands retaliation. Excitement encourages impulsive decisions. Comfort whispers, "You can begin tomorrow." The voice of emotion is loud. The voice of principle is usually quiet. Yet throughout history, the individuals who created lasting influence often learned to listen to the quieter voice. The ancient teachers understood something that modern society has largely forgotten. Feelings are valuable. They provide information. But information is not the same as direction. A traveler may observe storm clouds gathering. The observation is useful. Allowing the storm to choose the destination is something entirely different. The wise acknowledge emotion. Then they ask a deeper question. What principle should guide my next action? Principles outlast emotions. Imagine a captain navigating a ship across the ocean. The sea changes constantly. Some days the water is calm. Other days, violent storms appear without warning. If the captain changed direction every time the waves shifted, the ship would wander endlessly. Instead, the captain relies upon something more stable. The stars, the compass, the map. These remain dependable even when the sea becomes unpredictable. The ancient teachers believed principles serve the same purpose within human life. Emotions resemble the weather. Principles resemble the compass. The weather deserves respect. The compass determines direction. Few people ever become aware of this, because modern life encourages immediate reaction. Buy what feels exciting. Say whatever anger suggests. Abandon difficult work when motivation fades. Seek comfort whenever discomfort appears. These impulses often feel natural, yet the ancient philosophers observed that a life directed entirely by emotion gradually loses consistency. Without consistency, trust weakens. Without consistency, discipline disappears. Without consistency, long-term vision slowly gives way to short-term satisfaction. Again, the hidden cause precedes the visible effect. Imagine an entrepreneur beginning a new business. The first months are filled with excitement. Every idea feels promising. Every possibility seems limitless. Then reality arrives. Unexpected costs, disappointing results, long hours, difficult decisions. At this point, emotion often changes. Excitement becomes frustration. Confidence becomes uncertainty. If every decision follows the emotional state of the moment, the project rarely survives. The ancient teachers would ask a different question. What principle first inspired this work? What value is being created? What long-term purpose remains worth pursuing? The entrepreneur who remembers these principles often continues moving forward, even while emotions fluctuate. Years later, observers admire what appears to be extraordinary persistence. The ancient teachers might simply call it fidelity to principle. The principle operates whether you are aware of it or not. This does not mean emotions should be ignored. Far from it. Emotions reveal important information. Fear may reveal preparation is needed. Sadness may reveal something meaningful has been lost. Joy may reveal alignment with one's values. The problem begins when emotion becomes the ruler rather than the advisor. The ancient philosophers encouraged balance. Feel deeply. Observe carefully. Choose deliberately. The decision belongs to awareness, not merely to emotion. Most people never notice how often they confuse desire with direction. They feel motivated today, so they begin. Tomorrow motivation fades, so they stop. A week later, inspiration returns. Another beginning follows. The cycle repeats. The visible result is inconsistency. The hidden cause is dependence upon emotional weather. Again, the outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. Now imagine someone learning a musical instrument. Some days practice feels joyful. Other days it feels repetitive. If emotion determines every practice session, progress becomes unpredictable. Yet, if principle guides behavior, something remarkable begins happening. The musician practices because growth matters more than temporary comfort. Years later, skill appears effortless. The audience applauds talent. The ancient teachers quietly recognize disciplined consistency. Principles outlast emotions. The same pattern appears within leadership. History repeatedly offers examples of individuals who remained calm while those around them panicked. This calmness did not necessarily arise because they experienced less fear. Often they felt the same uncertainty as everyone else. The difference lay elsewhere. They had learned not to surrender decision-making entirely to passing emotion. Imagine a team facing an unexpected crisis. One leader reacts immediately. Their anxiety spreads throughout the room. Confusion multiplies. Trust weakens. Another leader pauses. They acknowledge the difficulty honestly. Then they ask, what is the wisest next step? The circumstances remain identical. The atmosphere changes completely. Because principles create stability, where emotions often create movement. The ancient teachers understood that people naturally trust those who remain anchored during uncertainty, not because such individuals possess all the answers, but because they possess something equally valuable. Inner direction. Again, the hidden cause quietly shapes the visible effect. Relationships reveal this principle just as clearly. Imagine a disagreement between two partners. Anger appears. Disappointment appears. Misunderstanding grows. Emotion suggests immediate retaliation. The ancient teachers proposed another possibility. Return to principle. If honesty is a principle, speak honestly. If respect is a principle, remain respectful even while disagreeing. If understanding is a principle, seek understanding before demanding it. Notice what happens. The emotion still exists, yet the behavior becomes guided by something more enduring. The relationship moves in a different direction, not because difficult feelings disappeared, because principles remained stronger than temporary reactions. Principles outlast emotions. Most people never notice that character is revealed most clearly when emotion and principle disagree. Anyone can remain patient while life feels easy. Anyone can speak kindly while receiving praise. The deeper test arrives during frustration, during disappointment, during uncertainty. These moments reveal what truly governs behavior. The ancient teachers believed that every difficult moment quietly asks a question. Will you act from habit, from emotion, or from principle? The answer gradually shapes identity. Identity shapes reputation. Reputation shapes opportunity. Again, the hidden cause always precedes the visible effect. Consider an individual committed to lifelong learning. There will be mornings when curiosity feels effortless. There will also be evenings when exhaustion whispers, "Skip today." If learning depends entirely upon enthusiasm, growth becomes inconsistent. If learning becomes a principle, progress quietly continues. The same pattern appears in physical health, financial responsibility, parenting, friendship, integrity. Nearly every meaningful achievement rests upon repeated choices guided by principles rather than moods. This is why the ancient teachers admired discipline so deeply. Discipline was never about punishment. It was about alignment. The alignment of daily action with enduring values. When action repeatedly reflects principle, life gradually acquires coherence. The inner conversation becomes clearer. The outer behavior becomes more consistent. Trust deepens. Confidence grows, not because life becomes easier, but because direction becomes steadier. Principles outlast emotions. As this understanding matures, another remarkable change quietly appears. Decision-making becomes simpler, not because every choice is obvious, but because a reliable foundation now exists. Instead of asking, "What do I feel like doing?" the wiser question becomes, "What kind of person am I becoming?" This single question shifts attention away from temporary emotion toward lasting character. The ancient teachers believed character was not created during extraordinary moments alone. It was quietly constructed through ordinary decisions repeated across ordinary days. The visible life simply revealed what had already been built within. Again, as within, so without. The person guided by principles does not become emotionless. They become intentional. Their emotions continue rising and falling like the tides. Yet beneath those changing waters remains something stable. A commitment, a direction, a way of living that does not disappear every time circumstances change. This is the deeper meaning of wisdom, not possessing endless knowledge, but allowing timeless principles to quietly shape ordinary decisions. Principles outlast emotions. As we approach the final stage of this journey, one final question remains. If thoughts shape beliefs, if beliefs shape actions, if principles shape character, then how should we live from this day forward? How do we transform understanding into a lifelong way of seeing the world? The ancient teachers believed the answer was not found in a single technique or final revelation. It was found in a way of living, a life guided by awareness, a life of continual observation, a life in which every experience becomes another opportunity to understand the hidden patterns beneath the surface. And that is where our journey reaches its final chapter. Chapter 10. The Mind That Creates the Future. As our journey draws toward its conclusion, one final truth quietly emerges from everything we have explored. The ancient teachers were never merely trying to change what people knew. They were trying to change the way people observed, because they understood something that continues to reveal itself across every generation. A different life rarely begins with different circumstances. More often, it begins with a different way of seeing. Throughout this audiobook, we have uncovered ideas that at first appeared separate. The invisible conversation within the mind, the beliefs we inherit without realizing it, the interpretations that quietly shape experience, the patterns that become identity, the stories we tell ourselves, the hidden chain connecting thought to action, the freedom found in responsibility, the discipline of becoming the observer, the wisdom of living by principles rather than passing emotion. Each chapter seemed to examine a different aspect of human life. Yet beneath them all rests one timeless principle. The future is quietly created long before it becomes visible. This is where the hidden law reveals itself one final time. Change your thinking. Change your direction. Notice the wording carefully. Not change your life overnight. Not control every circumstance. Not eliminate every difficulty. Direction. The ancient teachers rarely promised immediate transformation. Instead, they emphasized something both humbler and far more enduring. A small change in direction, maintained consistently over time, eventually produces a completely different destination. Imagine standing at the helm of a ship crossing a vast ocean. A shift of only a few degrees appears almost meaningless during the first hour. The coastline still looks familiar. The waves remain the same. Nothing dramatic seems to happen. Yet after weeks at sea, that small adjustment leads to an entirely different shore. Human life often unfolds in exactly the same way. One thought changes. A new question is asked. A different habit is practiced. A familiar reaction is replaced with a conscious response. At first, nothing appears extraordinary. Months pass. Years pass. Then, one day, the individual looks back and realizes they are living a life that once seemed impossible to imagine. Not because of one dramatic moment, because of countless small moments guided in a different direction. The hidden cause quietly became the visible effect. Most people never notice this because they expect transformation to feel dramatic. The ancient teachers understood that the deepest changes are often the quietest. A tree does not become tall in a single afternoon. A river does not carve a canyon in one day. Character is not built in a weekend. Wisdom is not acquired in a single conversation. Everything meaningful develops through patient repetition. The principle operates whether you are aware of it or not. This understanding changes the way we think about personal growth. Many people approach growth as though it were a project with a finishing line. They imagine that one day they will finally become disciplined enough, confident enough, peaceful enough, wise enough. Then the work will be complete. The ancient philosophers smiled at this idea, not because growth is impossible, but because life itself never stops inviting us to grow. Each season presents different lessons. Each relationship reveals different aspects of ourselves. Each challenge uncovers strengths and weaknesses that previously remained hidden. Mastery is not a destination. It is a relationship with continual learning. Few people ever become aware of this. Imagine a master craftsman who has worked with wood for 50 years. Someone asks, "Have you finally learned everything?" The craftsman quietly smiles. Each piece of wood possesses a different grain. Each project teaches something new. Experience has not ended learning. Experience has deepened curiosity. The ancient teachers believed wisdom followed the same path. The more clearly we see, the more deeply we realize there is still more to observe. This realization is not discouraging. It is liberating, because it removes the impossible burden of perfection. The purpose is not to become flawless. The purpose is to become increasingly conscious. Again, awareness becomes the doorway. Throughout this audiobook, awareness has appeared again and again. Observe the inner conversation. Observe inherited beliefs. Observe interpretations. Observe emotional reactions. Observe patterns. Observe habits. Observe assumptions. Not to criticize them, not to fear them, simply to see them clearly. The ancient teachers understood that observation itself possesses quiet power. What remains unconscious quietly governs us. What becomes conscious gradually becomes available for transformation. Again, the outer world is only the visible effect. The real cause exists elsewhere. Imagine walking through an unfamiliar forest at night, carrying only a small lantern. The lantern does not illuminate the entire journey. It reveals only the next few steps. Yet those few steps are enough. As you continue walking, more of the path becomes visible. The ancient teachers often viewed awareness in the same way. You do not need to understand your entire future today. You only need enough clarity to take the next conscious step. Then the next. Then the next. The future gradually reveals itself through continued observation and action. Change your thinking. Change your direction. This principle becomes deeply practical when applied to everyday life. Tomorrow morning, Before checking your phone, observe your first thoughts. During a difficult conversation, observe your first interpretation. When disappointment appears, observe the story your mind immediately begins creating. When success arrives, observe the beliefs that helped create it. Life itself becomes the classroom. Every conversation becomes a lesson. Every challenge becomes a mirror. Every success becomes an opportunity to understand hidden principles more deeply. Most people never notice this. They divide life into ordinary moments and meaningful moments. The ancient teachers recognized no such distinction. Every moment contains instruction for those who are paying attention. Waiting in traffic, preparing a meal, receiving criticism, making a decision, feeling afraid, feeling grateful. Each experience quietly reveals something about the mind. The student who remains aware never runs out of teachers, because life itself becomes the teacher. This is why the ancient philosophers placed such importance on intentional action. Observation without action becomes entertainment. Knowledge without application remains potential. Understanding becomes wisdom only when it begins shaping behavior. Imagine reading hundreds of books about swimming while never entering the water. Knowledge accumulates. Experience does not. The same is true of conscious living. Knowing that thoughts influence action changes little. Observing thoughts daily changes everything. Understanding that habits shape identity is valuable. Practicing new habits patiently transforms identity. Again, the hidden cause precedes the visible effect. The future is not created by extraordinary intentions alone. It is quietly built through ordinary actions performed consciously. One honest conversation, one disciplined morning, one thoughtful decision, one courageous response, then another, and another. Small causes become great effects. As we step back and observe the entire journey, another remarkable pattern becomes visible. Every chapter has pointed toward the same invitation. Become less automatic. Become more aware. Become less controlled by inherited patterns. Become more guided by conscious principles. Become less reactive. Become more intentional. Not because this guarantees an easy life, but because it creates a meaningful one. The ancient teachers believed that genuine freedom does not arise from controlling every event. It arises from developing the inner capacity to meet every event consciously. That capacity grows slowly, quietly, patiently, like the sunrise appearing before anyone notices, like roots strengthening beneath the soil before branches reach toward the sky. Its progress is often invisible until one day the entire landscape has changed. The hidden cause quietly becomes the visible effect. Change your thinking. Change your direction. Perhaps this is why these teachings have endured for so many centuries, not because they offer secret powers, not because they promise perfect lives, but because they remind us of something both ancient and timeless. The quality of our lives is deeply connected to the quality of our awareness. The stories we repeatedly believe become the choices we repeatedly make. The choices we repeatedly make become the habits we repeatedly live. Those habits quietly become character, and character gradually shapes the future. Everything begins in the mind. The mind first imitates before it creates. Patterns become destiny. Awareness rewrites the story. The hidden cause creates the visible effect. Responsibility creates freedom. You are the observer, not every thought. Principles outlast emotions. Change your thinking. Change your direction. These are not merely phrases to remember. They are invitations to practice. Tomorrow, the world will continue moving as it always has. People will hurry through familiar routines. Old habits will quietly repeat themselves. The invisible conversations inside millions of minds will continue without being noticed. The principles we have explored will remain active whether anyone remembers them or not. The question has never been whether these principles exist. The question is whether you will choose to live with them consciously, whether you will pause before reacting, observe before believing, question before accepting, choose before repeating, and slowly, patiently, shape a future that begins not with chance, but with awareness. For in the end, the greatest transformation is not becoming someone else. It is finally becoming conscious of the one person you have been shaping all along. And that journey, like the mind itself, never truly ends. You have spent this journey exploring an idea that has echoed across centuries. Not that every thought instantly changes reality, but that the thoughts you repeatedly cultivate become the beliefs you live by, the decisions you make, and the habits that quietly shape your future. Throughout this audiobook, we have seen that awareness comes before transformation. You cannot guide what you never observe. You cannot change what you refuse to examine. The ancient teachers did not ask us to believe blindly. They asked us to pay attention, to notice the conversations within, to question inherited assumptions, to replace unconscious reaction with deliberate understanding. Tomorrow, your circumstances may look much the same, but you will have an opportunity that was always available. You can observe your thoughts before they become words, your words before they become actions, your actions before they become habits, and your habits before they become your life. The mind is not merely a place where thoughts appear. It is the place where futures begin. The question is no longer whether your thoughts influence your life. The question is, what kind of thoughts will you choose to cultivate from this moment forward?